Hey everyone. Our next speaker is Matthew Geiger. He's currently a PhD student in Spain, and Donald's former student. He was a guest lecturer at Oxy, and he just published his first book, The Economic of Suicide. Ooh.
Um, yeah, I'll give a brief introduction to myself. Um, so I attended Occidental in 2016 to 2020, and within my first year, that's where I met Professor Jurgen, and he offered a course called Making Economic Sense, which he said his Econ 309 this course on Austrian economics will be a prerequisite. So it was the application of markets to all aspects of society and what can be provided by markets. And then I went on to take, I think a total of 5 courses with Professor Durden as well. He was teaching assistant for 2 semesters. And he helped send me to Mises University in 2018. And I attended some other summer programs, including the Severo Institute, the Ron Paul Institute, and then I went to Spain to study with Professor Huerta de Soto at Rey Juan Carlos and did my master's there. And that's where I wrote my master's thesis, my trabajo fin de master, which was the economics of suicide, and I just got it published titled An Economic Analysis of Suicide. And currently working on my PhD thesis of the same topic. Um, and now I'm teaching here. And I want to mention where I studied and what I studied to tell you guys that I think if these ideas of economics and freedom and liberty are important to you and something that intellectually engages with curiosity, then I think you're at the best place and in the best program. And it's an honor for me to teach, not only for you guys, but alongside my professor there. Um, Today I'm going to cover some history of economic thought, and I'll give a brief introduction to the classical school of economic thought, but Professor Skousen is going to be lecturing to you guys today on that, so I don't want to go too much into that. I will say that Professor Murray Rothbard has a good 2-volume series on the history of economic thought. And forgive me, Professor Skousen, but I have yet to read your book on the making of modern economics. So let's begin. So this is what I will be covering in Introduction to the Classical School of Economic Thought, Mercantilism, Feudalism, and the Industrial Revolution. So if you look at Professor Rothbard's History of Economic Thought, he begins with the Greeks, ancient Greeks, from Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and I think what's interesting is there's a good book called The Ancient City by Numas Fusale-Coulange, and he talks about how in ancient Greece there was no concept of individual liberty. They were essentially ultra fascistic. The way that they looked at their life in the world was theological in the sense that they had a god of the family, a god of the hearth, they had a god of the city, the community, and gods kind of in these concentric circles. And the role of life for the ancient Greeks was one of honoring the father and the god, because when the father passes, I believe he becomes, a part of the hearth and in the spiritual world. So this concept of individual liberty, it was an idea that has evolved over time. And I think that's important to remember in the sense that ideas of economics also evolve over time. The Whig theory of history is the idea that just due to time, we have better ideas that go on top of each other that lead us to making more informed decisions. But that's not necessarily the case. It's like a zigzag pattern where we have good ideas in one place in time, and then other ideas come in that may not be as good. And so they have to be not only refuted, but combated in the sense of their adoption, of the society that takes on these ideas, or the intellectuals that take on these ideas. They need to be exposed to alternative ideas. So I think that's more of, the theoretical methodology of economics that we'll look into in the future. But a lot of modern economists don't even consider the history of economic thought. They kind of just will bypass it and we'll jump right into our assumptions and our models and stuff. But I think it's important to go over the history of economic thought, not only to see the thinkers that came before, but what ideas they had and how that influenced their societies and the cultural lives. So yeah, we have the Greco-Roman period with the philosophers and economists in this area, and also in the introduction to Rothbard's book, or On the Greeks, he talks about that after Aristotle, one of his pupils, Alexander the Great, Greece was crumbling, and the economic communities were like called councils of despair, of how do we get people to adopt this new austerity of being impoverished. And that's kind of what I find interesting, that economics was used not to theorize prosperity, but to theorize poverty. It's interesting. Then we have some aspects of the Indians and the Persians, scholars that influence ideas on economics and politics. The Arabs and the Chinese, which is very interesting, not only Lao Tzu, but Chuang Tzu, I believe his name is, as Rothbard referred to him as the first anarchist, and Pao, I believe, another Chinese philosopher. The Chinese philosophers were very interesting, as Lao Tzu talks about in Tao Te Ching, the way the government that governs best is the government that governs least. So they have these ideas of free markets and individualism in essence, but they didn't so much have a formal theory of economics, as was later discovered with the early modern period of the Spanish scholastics who followed the teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas at the University of Salamanca and the Spanish Golden Age. And I know my professor, Jorge de Soto, has argued that the Austrian school should be referred to as the Spanish school because the Spanish, well, there was many of them, but they had ideas of subjective value, of interest rates, of the relations between cost and price. So they had a lot of the ideas that became the foundation for what the Austrian school is. Although I don't think Menger cites a lot of the Spaniards in his work, but they were definitely touching upon many of the ideas that is relevant to the Austrian school today. And we had the 18th century physiocracy with the French physiocrats, Jean-Baptiste, Richard Cantillon was kind of independent, Turgot, and Bastiat. And these thinkers were really touching upon the importance of individualism and the role of land, and the ideas of free markets. And so at the time, in the 16th century, we have the ideas of mercantilism and feudalism. And mercantilism from 16th to 18th century was it was an economic system, and feudalism was a political system. The idea that it should be the nobility that owns the land, and then the rest of the population are serfs, and they're going to work for the land. So human history is from its inception to about 1800. 90% of the population were agrarian workers. They were working in the fields, and this was a very impoverished state of living, but they had no other system of looking at society and economics. But we'll get to that in just a second. And I'll just touch upon classical school of economic thought. We have Adam Smith and his work, The Wealth of Nations. And we have the marginalist school Yes, the marginalist revolution, which occurred in 1871, which was the simultaneous, I would say, not discovery, but is referred to as a discovery between Carl Menger, Stanley Jevons, and Leon Walras. And the idea that its value is discovered on the margin of a homogeneous good or a stock. Whereas some of the flaws of the classical school, which I just will briefly mention, is their objective theory of value. And I think what's also interesting to remark is that Puerta de Soto references this book, which I have here, just to show you. I forgot the title.
It's different from Jesus work.
Oh, Professor Jesus Puerta de Soto.
Okay, I thought you said Hornby.
Oh no, Puerta de Soto, the Austrian school. So this is kind of a history of economic thought that's much shorter than Professor Rothbard's treatise on it. But well, actually, it was Rothbard in his introduction that talks about how religion played a significant role in the development of economic ideas. For example, in Spain, under Catholicism, the Spanish scholastics recognized that production is for consumption. But whereas under the Calvinists in Britain, their idea was that production in itself was a value. So then they developed this labor theory of value and the objective theory of value, that it is production and hard work and labor that is a value in its sense, in itself. And that I think really did influence what their ideas of value were. Whereas, the Spanish, being Catholic, understood that it's for consumption that we produce certain things. It's not the product in itself that is valuable, but what we can use these products for. Touch on that. So then we have the Marxian school with Karl Marx, and Professor Rothbard says that Adam Smith was a necessary precursor to Marx, because Marx also followed this objective theory of value and the labor theory of value, and his ideas on, the proletariat and the revolution, but we won't go into that right now. And then you have the neoclassical school, which I will cover tomorrow. But this builds on the classical economics, and the neo aspect refers to the use of mathematics, or this approach to the economy, much like the physicists, thinking that we can model the real world, but they bypass this whole idea of consciousness and humanity in their determination of how an economy operates. But I'll go into that tomorrow. So then we have the Austrian school with the founder of Carl Menger and deductive a priori methodology. And we have the Keynesian school with John Maynard Keynes, who was the beloved student of Alfred Marshall, who was a neoclassical. And Keynes, which I'll also go into tomorrow, pretty much said that the neoclassicals are missing this whole conception of macroeconomics, or the economy at large, and it's microeconomics, which the neoclassicals really focused on. But yeah, I'll talk tomorrow as well. Let me bypass this. So we get into mercantilism, state control of the economy. It is the state that and its interests that should be prioritized over the individuals. And Mises says we can't condemn the mercantilists because they didn't know how to deal with the societies or the systems that they had at that time. So you had Thomas Malthus, who was saying that essentially populations can only reach a certain point, and there's not enough resources to support all these people. So we have these cycles of too many people, not enough resources, and so then population must diminish, and then we'll have an abundance of resources, and then the population will increase again. And up until about 1800, the population in England was only about 6 million people. So the mercantilists also viewed that it is the inflow of money that's what's important, and we should have these the surplus of money and export more goods than we import. And so this idea of trade deficits, I think, originated with the mercantilists and was very important in their conception of how wealth is created. Well, we can critique this.
Sounds very familiar to today's policy.
Yes. So mercantilists were not free trade advocates because they wanted this favorable trade balance. They were in favor of imposing tariffs, and tariffs are, I forget the economist who said this, but if goods don't cross borders, armies do, soldiers do.
Austria.
Austria. Yes. And this is the idea that either we can have the economic means of societal relations and the law of nations between nations, or we can have the political means, which is by power and by force, and trying to conquer other nations to obtain their wealth and resources, rather than having free market and trading. And so we have colonial expansion, and I forget who this joke is attributed to, but it's that the sun never, well, I don't know if it's a joke, but the sun never sets in Britain. And the idea being that Britain has these colonies all over the world, from India, China, into the Americas. So the sun never sets. And so they wanted this colonial expansion. It was actually in their ideological and economic interest to expand and conquer. They had serfs under mercantilism and feudalism, which was a form of slavery, contributes to the perpetuation of slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries. Yes, mercantilists demanded cheap labor in the colonies. So why would they be opposed to slavery and cheap labor, and if it suits their interests? We have the Code of Hammurabi, which references slavery and includes regulations on slave rights, duties, and punishments. Slavery had a long history across various civilizations. Mercantilism played a significant role in shaping the economic and social landscapes of its time, leaving a lasting impact on global history. And under feudalism, we have the hierarchical social and political structures preceding the Industrial Revolution. So this was a type of organization, a societal organization that favored the kings. It didn't favor individuals. And this conception of individual sovereignty and individual liberty only came about from economic wealth under feudalism was the countries or the kings. Feudalism established a rigid hierarchical social structure that defined economic and social relationships for centuries, with the nobility exercising significant control over land and resources. So, getting into the classical school, I'll ask this question. What happened in 1750 that gave rise to classical economic thought? And we touched upon it a couple times. Gabriel.
It was Protestantism, right?
Not.
Well, yeah, before the Industrial, and then the Industrial.
And then the Industrial Revolution. So, the Industrial Revolution, there's many aspects to it, and this is kind of what I want to focus on today. And I'll ask you this question, it's a joke. But what did socialists use before they used candles for light bulbs? It's a pretty good one. It's not original to me.
Well, they climate change people.
Great.
Let's use that one.
So the Industrial Revolution, there's many approaches. Different thinkers have different ideas about the Industrial Revolution. Professor Hans-Hermann talks about that it was ideas that really evolved over time and helped necessitate what became this Industrial Revolution. Because okay, so if we begin with our economic theory, we have Crusoe on our deserted island, and Crusoe wants to build up capital so he can essentially become more wealthy. But what's important is he has the ideas, the plans. He's going to build a fishing rod or a net. He has to have the ideas about what he's going to build. It is not just invested time and labor. He has to have the plans to make what he's going to create. And in the Industrial Revolution was ideas combined with capital accumulation. For the first time, people were able to accumulate capital and invest it in these new lines of production. So yes, we have things like technology and agricultural innovations. And so productivity is really what helps contribute to the prosperity of society. And so I want to get to, perhaps I'll come back. Yeah. If we look at this graph, this is a very important graph, especially for the history of economic thought, because before 1800, this was usually the per capita GDP of most of human history. And by the initiation of the Industrial Revolution in England by 1800, population doubled. Not only that, by I believe 1850 to 19th century, the population was multiplying. We had lower infant mortality, longer lifespans, due to our ability to accumulate capital. And a lot of the Romanticist philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau praised the pre-industrial revolution living conditions as desirable. But this is very much an intellectual error, because what were women and children doing before the Industrial Revolution? Well, women were trying to make food, and children were trying to not starve. That's why everyone was pretty much an agrarian worker. And the important aspect to understand is that no one forced these people into the factories. They were abhorrent conditions, yes. You did have child labor, horrible working conditions, but that's because there was no alternative for them and for their survival other than this agrarian labor. So these conditions, in a way, were almost I don't want to say essential, but they were necessary as a part of a nation to develop, to industrialize, to accumulate this capital. And capitalism, as Mises regards it, is mass production for the masses, the needs of the masses. That is, that it began with these business owners who are very much self-interested to invest in capital, to create goods that were for the people who were working in these factories. So luxury goods were only something that was later created as opposed to the needs of the masses, of cheaper, more abundant goods. And as Mises says, the watchword of the Industrial Revolution is markets. It was markets, and then markets that helped create the higher living conditions that people of the early centuries couldn't even dream of. And the process of markets, as we'll get into in the Cadillac, is something that has to be renewed daily, because it is only through providing for consumers that someone can accumulate wealth and become prosperous. So in the ideas of Lenin, he viewed people as already being slaves under the capitalist system. He didn't see people as being individual sovereigns or recognized consumer sovereignty. But the essence of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism is that it allowed people to become sovereign in society because they had capital. The consumers were able to essentially choose, and it was by their buying and their obsession for buying that they were able to essentially put economic power not only into their own hands, but the businesses and the producers that would satisfy their needs the most. It isn't due to some harmonious love that brought about better living conditions. It was from people's self-interest that they wanted more and better quality goods that allowed them to decide where they were going to patron and by who or from who they were going to patron these products. And this capital accumulation allowed business people to become more wealthy. And the inverse too, profit and loss. Because someone had losses, they incurred losses meant that they weren't satisfying the consumers as much as their competitors. So they were put out of business. And the resources that they once had were sold off and used to other ends that was then revealed in the market, more preferable to consumers. So this is a dynamic process that occurs daily. And it required the foundation of not only capitalism, but individualism too. Because without, which is the word of property, without private property, there's no way we can have capital or accumulate capital or invest capital. You can't. The mark of freedom in society is, or liberty, is the ability to assent or dissent, both in ideology and in practice of what ideas you want to have and share and what you would like to buy and not buy. And so this is, as Frank Fetter regarded, the market democracy. In regards to, or in comparison to political democracy. What is a political democracy? It's the idea that I vote for someone, in a series of terms. I like the example Michael Malins uses, that I can choose between, in a market, any variety of any good I want, right? But when it comes to a democracy, two parties, it's like choosing between Coke or Pepsi. It's the illusion of a choice. A true preference is not only of the popular choices, but of the marginal and minority choices, as long as they're not negligible. But then you should be able to choose, as you do in markets, any flavor of soda, for example, that you want to use or have. And it's under a political democracy that you're just presented with two choices. So they say that the rule of one, a king, is a tyranny, but the choice of two is democracy and freedom. But this is not a real choice. This is an arbitrary choice. And I think we can get into political theory eventually, but to briefly mention, I think as Aristotle said, monarchy the rule of one, oligarchy the rule of few, and democracy the rule of many. So this is the tyranny of the majority. So touch upon some of the developments of the Industrial Revolution was agriculture, manufacturing, machinery, mining, transportation. And this was the idea of productivity, that one person can now do the job of several people. And several people before were required to farm the land, but now with the development of steam engine, tractors, and these types of ideas, that one person could now do what several men, was required of several men. And what was it? The Luddites viewed the development of economies and productivity as something that would, or automation as being something that would like riddle humans out of the workforce and into this poverty. But that didn't come. What happened was the deepening of specialization, and the more people could specialize, then the more capital accumulation we can obtain and develop for people. That is why we have, the abundance of wealth we have in the modern age compared to centuries prior, is because of capital accumulation. And to mention more on the point of private property and what it's allowed for us, I think people take it for granted of what this concept of liberty and property has given us. To try to create alternative sports or artistic expressions, it only comes from private property. Because if you don't have private property, if you don't have the choice, not only of who to vote for, then you're not, as Mises says, a man. And then your choice to rear progeny could also be stripped from you. Because he says freedom is indivisible. So you need private property if you want to dissent, if you want to be creative, if you want to put these things into practice, to try to be an entrepreneur and innovate new ways of serving your fellow men and consumers better. Some more key developments of the Industrial Revolution with the telegraph, formation of capital stock, technological progress, even communication, the way we communicate with cell phones, all comes from these innovations in communication, corresponding all over the world. Social media is only possible, this ability to communicate through technology. Instead of allowing just the heads of governments to communicate for us that this is what this country is saying, we can talk to anyone. We can talk to people in Iran. We can talk to people anywhere in the Middle East, in Ukraine, in Russia. Now they want to bypass this because they're incentivized to propagate wars and the idea is that certain people are evil across the world. But with the further development of communications, we will see that I don't have any enemies in the Middle East. These things are just perpetuated by the propagandists, militarists. But yes. So the ideas of mercantilism and feudalism were refuted not by apologists for capitalism, but by the pure industrialization, by the pure matter of fact that we have more wealth and abundance of goods at our hands. I think the downfall of the Soviet Union was partially a credit to the people living there in the Soviet Union, seeing that even the housemaids of America had fur coats, and that they were living better than the citizenry of the Soviet Union. And once people recognize that, then it's hard to believe the lies that you're living a better life. I think North Korea, at the moment, they're told many lies about America and other places, but they're also told that they have the best. And I don't know anyone who would want to trade their life here in the US for life in North Korea. So, along with productivity in this division of labor, we have an increase in purchasing power. And yes, it took time, but purchasing power is essentially economic power. Political power is, what the state has over its citizenry. And in that book I mentioned, the ancient city. I think in that book he mentions that the term civilian in ancient Greece meant high-class slave. So to be a civilian, under that definition, means you're a high-class slave, but you're still a slave. And I think what we're trying to study here is, the idea of the freedom, not to be a slave, but to be a free thinking person. So I think that's part of this paradigm shift of recognizing which freedoms have been taken from you. And it's the Orwellian and newspeak or doublespeak, where they'll take a word and define it to be essentially the inverse of what is actually implemented and practiced. Yes. And so during this time, in the late 18th century, up until I believe 1815, was the revolutionary period. And so you had the French Revolution, and England was sending, I believe, a lot of troops and were funding France at the time. So, as I think Professor Ralph Reichel talks about, there was a dip in the early 18th century, as well as a wheat tariff or something where they didn't want to import wheat, which obviously affected their economy and society. Um, but then after the revolutionary period, with the installation of both the Industrial Revolution and democracy, a lot of thinkers, especially who are historians, will credit democracy as being the beginning, as democracy really took off in the 20th century, but as being the institutional formation of society that should be accredited for the increased levels of individual freedom and prosperity. But as many professors of economics point out, including Professor Hoppe, that this is an intellectual error. That actually it was democracy that kind of dragged us and our ability to prosper further. Yeah, but we'll get into that more eventually. I do want to also have time to take some questions, but yeah, if there's any momentary questions, we can cover some. That's okay. So some questions arose during this time. Land ownership. Who should own the land? Before, under monarchies, it was really the divine rights theory that it was God and his choice of determining who should rule, which was the kings and the aristocrats. But then, under this industrial revolution, it was not only revolutionary in prosperity, but of land ownership. That people can own their own land, create their own wealth, and employ it in the economy that can help flourish, create abundance for the rest of society, and furthering the division of labor. And this goes in part with the production organization, price and wage determination. How much should we pay someone for doing this job? Well, we can impose certain law or bureaucratic mandates on how much a wage should be, but from the Industrial Revolution and capital accumulation, wages steadily begin to rise. So per capita GDP was able to rise because people were able to further specialize in their production and their ability to trade it, created these profits that then they were able to spend or invest on laborers, which was their wage rates. And so wage rates began to rise, not due to the unions, as a lot of union historians will like to credit, but due to economics, due to capital accumulation of the for-profit organization of businesses and economies that allowed for the increasing standard of living for these workers, these laborers, the consumers, who are also, the laborers are the consumers who buy the produced products in mass from these factories. So there was two forms of land ownership: communal ownership, communism, and individual ownership, capitalism, or private ownership. Um, I'll read you this slide. These classical economists recognize that private ownership and the price system can efficiently coordinate economic activities, leading to optimal resource allocation and economic productivity. Um, well, I want to.
May I ask a question before we continue about a difference? So mercantilism was a time when merchants ran things, no?
Not
Like,
necessarily. It was actually that the state should rule the economic realm. Merchants, perhaps the term itself might get conflated, but it was yes, there were merchants, but it was
mhm.
at the interest of the king or the state rather than private merchants.
Interesting. So the reason why I asked that was to set up the idea of like, could that intermediary class of people between the king and the other country, the merchants or whatever, could they not accumulate capital? And is it the Industrial Revolution that sets them apart from the modern, like, pro-shareholder capitalist idea, or like the private ownership of production? Because if you're a sugar merchant, you own presumably land, or the king gives you land for you to grow sugar on, no?
Mhm.
So is that not capital accumulation? And what sets them apart from the people with factories?
Well, the capital accumulation, yes, exists, but it's not held privately or individually. It's technically like enti yeah, entitled. Yeah, someone is producing and developing and accumulating capital, but it is dictated and mandated by the king of the state, of what is being produced and who owns it. Uh, resides with the state. So you have industry, but to a limited extent, and the ownership is what's important because again, the king is determining who's going to produce what and what they're going to produce, and not until this individualist capital accumulation came about that people were able to exercise aspects of entrepreneurship of different types of production and put it to the test, if you will, of profit and loss in the market and letting people, the consumers, decide what they're going to patron and what they would like. And so entrepreneurship is really the aspect that was foregone under mercantilism. And it's with entrepreneurship that people are able to decide more or less at the demands of consumers what new innovative products we can provide to people. But so, yeah, in a sense, there was capital accumulation, but it wasn't private. It was still for the king and the nobility and the aristocratic society, which was like roughly 10% of the population
Mhm.
throughout those times.
So the difference maker was individual choice had to become politically feasible at the same time as individual purchasing power became a thing.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, they went hand in hand.
Hmm.
As someone
Yeah.
accumulated purchasing power, they had what was called economic power.
Hmm.
And the economic power helped create, the spontaneous order of market mechanisms, and create wealth and investments in capital structures that were heterogeneous from what came about before.
Hmm.
Most of production was agrarian or agriculture, um, and it was with industry and mass production for the needs of the masses that new types of goods were able to come about and increase quality of goods.
Hmm. The reason why I mentioned political feasibility is because I think the contribution of the French is really important. Uh, I think the guillotine was also an economic contribution, to make things possible.
Yeah, I see sympathize with that point. Um, Rothbard writes a bit about that time during the French Revolution. Um, but I think the political ideology that a lot of people were pursuing um, overlooked the economic development of what was also occurring simultaneously with the Industrial Revolution.
Hmm.
So this political revolution was simultaneously occurring with the Industrial Revolution, and I think that's why a lot of people accredit the revolutionary period as what brought about this revolutionary economic um, period. But to some extent, they are distinct, and I think that's what economic history can really shed light upon, was that it wasn't just this political system that brought about these new living conditions. It was very much an economic system and reorganization of capital structures that went in hand with political structures, but um, the economic structures also had a very strong hand to play in revolutionizing the political structures.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Beautiful.
Thank you. Yes.
I think in your presentation, you briefly mentioned, I think in your reputation of the Keynesian revolution, that process of markets is renewed daily.
Yeah.
I was just wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit on that, on that
Yes.
statement.
So what I mean by the process is renewed daily is that to be an entrepreneur, the term etymologically refers to someone who sees and looks out. And so they're trying to find what piece may be underdeveloped or is missing from an economy for their own profitable accumulation of wealth. So that's why there is an aspect of knowledge from the millions, if not billions, of participants in a market that can try to innovate or at least, attempt to accumulate or contribute something in a market environment. And if someone fails to satisfy their consumers, then they'll accumulate losses to the point of having to sell off their remaining capital and due to comparative advantage, get into something else. So this process of daily renewing the services, the goods and services to consumers is fundamental to capitalism and competition. It requires this thinking persistence of how am I satisfying consumers and how can I satisfy them better. And if I fail to do that as an entrepreneur, then I'll be outcompeted. And the competition will only satisfy other consumers better. So consumers are never satiated. And if someone offers something better, then the consumers can go to them. It's not this, under the political system, they don't have a choice. With a political system, you're taxed, so you pay for something, and then it's usually a monopoly on the provision of this good or service. There's no market for it. That's why, under a monopoly of the provision of a certain industry, usually from the state of education or security in the form of policing, the quality goes down as the price goes up. Whereas under market competitive environments, the quality of goods and services go up and the price tends to go down. Now, due to, effects and pressures on money, we don't necessarily see prices going down. But technological innovations are usually at a price, and over time, the price tends to follow as we develop more productive ways of producing these goods, like TVs, or that's a good example. But the appliances that we have manifest from capital accumulation, like the amenities of laundry services, microwaves, televisions, cars, were not even thought of by people centuries prior. And I think that speaks to how exponential human wealth has grown and will grow. So we kind of dawn into this technological digital revolution. And this, I really do think, will help exponentially increase wealth, the goods and services we can accumulate even more.
Thank you.
Well, this was my first in-person lecture, so thank you guys very much.